At the threshold of consequence, Why America Must Reestablish a Regenerative Economy. Author Othniel Max Daves. Date, November 14th, 2025. Author's note. This document was born in the quiet aftermath of a moment I can only describe as professionally tragicomic. Listening to a live Council on Foreign Relations Task Force panel, confidently reciting yesterday's orthodoxy as though it were newly revealed wisdom. If one wished to observe the closing moments of an intellectual empire in decline, this panel offered a nearly perfect case study. The tone was polished, the confidence unwavering, the analysis impeccably out of date. The participants spoke as if reading from a sacred scroll titled, How to Repeat the Last 30 Years and Expect a Different Outcome. There were invocations of global competitiveness, as though the United States still possesses an intact industrial base to compete with. There were repeated references to strategic alliances, delivered with the enthusiasm of people who have not noticed that many of these alliances now function as elaborate supply chain dependencies, benefiting everyone but us. And of course, there was the perennial favorite, the assurance that the market will adjust, delivered with the serene conviction of individuals for whom markets have always adjusted in their personal favor. What struck me most was the panel's almost athletic ability to avoid the obvious. Not once did anyone acknowledge that the economic model they keep prescribing, an extractive architecture optimized for global arbitrage and quarterly earnings, has already hollowed out the very foundations of national resilience. Nor did anyone hint at the possibility that their beloved playbooks, now worn thin from overuse, might no longer fit the geopolitical reality confronting the nation. Instead, they offered polished commentary designed to reassure themselves that nothing fundamental needs to change. It would have been funny if it weren't so consequential. The intellectual habit of mistaking familiarity for truth is how empires sunset themselves. If the panel offered anything of value, it was as a living exhibit in the anthropology of institutional complacency. These were not uneducated people. They were exceptionally educated. That is precisely the problem. They were educated in a belief system that treats the global economy as a kind of frictionless utopia in which geography, manufacturing capacity, and national resilience play almost no role. It is a worldview in which the United States can offshore its productive base indefinitely, outsource its supply chains to geopolitical competitors, weaken its middle class, and still expect the world to behave as though nothing material has changed. To listen to the panel was to watch the cognitive dissonance of elite institutions in real time. Impeccably credentialed experts using increasingly sophisticated vocabulary to explain why. The old frameworks still work, even as those frameworks collapse under their own contradictions. This document exists because the polite fiction celebrated in rooms like that one can no longer sustain the Republic. The extractive paradigm they defend subtly is not merely misaligned with reality, it is actively accelerating national fragility. Their thinking is not inside the box. Their thinking is the box, and the box is dark and collapsing in upon itself. The path forward requires a regenerative economic model built from the ground up, place-based, vertically integrated, strategically aligned, and grounded in the physical reality of a nation that must learn once again to produce what it consumes. This is not nostalgia. It is sobriety. I write this author's note with full respect for the individuals on that panel, but with no patience for the illusions they continue to protect. When a nation reaches the boundary between consequence and collapse, the most dangerous people in the room are the ones insisting that nothing fundamental needs to change. Consider what follows an unwelcome act of intellectual intervention. An attempt to drag national policy thinking out of the 1990s, past the comfortable dead ends of globalist fantasy, and into the world as it actually exists. If the old playbooks were sufficient, the present crisis would not exist. They are not. The crisis does. To pretend otherwise may be fashionable in elite circles, but it is no longer survivable nor wise. Introduction. The threshold of consequence. Every nation passes through moments when the accumulated weight of past decisions collides with the hard limits of reality. In such periods, familiar assumptions fail, established institutions lose coherence, and the existing economic architecture no longer produces stability but accelerates disorder. The United States, and the broader Western world, has entered precisely such a threshold. The symptoms are visible across every layer of national life. Crumbling industrial foundations, fragmented social cohesion, brittle supply chains, degrading infrastructure, geopolitical vulnerability, and an increasingly anxious population, sensing that the center cannot hold. These symptoms, however, are not isolated problems. They are consequences of a deeper structural design failure, an economic paradigm that has hollowed out the foundations of the society it was entrusted to sustain. For most of its history, the American Republic was built upon a regenerative economic model rooted in local production, regional integration, national strategy, and long-term investment. Cities, towns, and rural regions were not peripheral. They were the engines of value creation. Manufacturing ecosystems, agricultural systems, energy infrastructures, and skilled trades formed the connective tissue between social stability and national strength. Wealth was created through real productive activity, not financial alchemy. The system regenerated itself through stewardship, apprenticeship, innovation, and intergenerational responsibility. This architecture began to fracture when extractive economic principles, offshoring, financialization, managerialism, global arbitrage, and cost minimization displaced the earlier model. What emerged was not merely a shift in economics, but a shift in the national psyche. Communities were reclassified as markets. Workers became cost centers. Land was commodified. Institutions were captured by short-term incentives. Strategy was replaced by speculation. The result was an economy that appeared efficient on spreadsheets, yet eroded the living foundations upon which real prosperity depends. The extractive paradigm has now reached a stage where its internal logic produces cascading fragilities. It rewards behavior that weakens the nation's productive core. It externalizes the costs of decay onto vulnerable communities. It incentivizes financial engineering over real value creation. And it blinds leaders in commercial, bureaucratic, and academic sectors to the structural collapse unfolding beneath them. Each group, in its own way, remains trapped in an outdated worldview. Commercial interests in their global arbitrage models, bureaucrats in their procedural maintenance logic, and academics in theoretical frameworks that no longer map to reality. Their frameworks cannot diagnose the crisis because they are products of the same paradigm that caused it. This document argues that the consequences of continuing along this trajectory will be profound, cascading, and indiscriminate. The system will not collapse neatly or slowly. It will unravel in waves that touch every class, every sector, and every geographic region. The top of society will not be insulated from the failures of the bottom because the foundations that sustain both are the same. Once the regenerative base is hollowed out, the entire structure, economic, social, political, and geopolitical, loses stability. Yet the situation is not irreversible. The same nation that once built the most productive economic system in the world possesses the latent capacity to rebuild a regenerative model, one rooted in place-based value creation, vertically integrated supply chains, resilient infrastructure, and long-horizon strategic coordination. But such a transformation requires abandoning the old playbooks that produced the current decline. It requires a new architecture, bottom-up, locally rooted, regionally scaled, nationally aligned, technologically advanced, and civically anchored. It demands leaders capable of thinking beyond the limits of financial abstraction and willing to re-engage with the real economy that underwrites national sovereignty and social stability. This introduction prepares the ground for the sections that follow, which will trace the historical shift from regenerative to extractive systems, demonstrate the existential consequences of failing to reverse this trajectory, expose the intellectual limitations of the commercial, bureaucratic, and academic classes, and articulate the imperative for a new regenerative economic paradigm. The nation stands at a decisive moment. What comes next will determine whether it enters a period of renewal or a cycle of decline from which recovery will grow increasingly difficult. We stand at the threshold of consequence. What follows is an examination of how we arrived here, and what must be done to reclaim a future worthy of inheritance. Exposing the mechanical heart of the machine and how to replace it with a real heart. Any serious discussion of national renewal has to begin with the structure of the economic system itself. The question is not simply growth versus decline, or capitalism versus something else, but whether the architecture of production, finance, and trade is regenerative or extractive. A regenerative economic model is vertically integrated from local to state to regional to national levels. It builds productive capacity from the bottom up, then connects that capacity into coherent value chains that serve the whole nation. An extractive economic model, by contrast, floats above the real economy, siphoning value out of local communities and degrading the very foundations on which it depends. Over time, the extractive model does not merely underperform. It hollows out the social, industrial, and civic infrastructure that any future recovery would require. The current extractive model can be understood as a system optimized for financial throughput rather than productive resilience. Its core logic is to minimize short-term costs, maximize returns to mobile capital, and arbitrage differences in labor standards, environmental regulations, and tax regimes across jurisdictions. Production migrates to wherever inputs are cheapest, governance is weakest, and externalities can be most easily offloaded. Domestic communities are increasingly reduced to consumption nodes, debt sinks, or resource extraction zones, rather than centers of value creation. Local labor is treated as a flexible cost rather than a long-term asset. Land is treated as a commodity rather than a living base of productive capacity. Institutions are treated as distribution channels rather than formative civic structures. This extractive logic souring the foundations can be seen in several interlocking dynamics. First, supply chains have been stretched into complex global webs that are extremely efficient on spreadsheets and extremely fragile in practice. A disruption in a single choke point can cascade across industries and regions. Second, capital markets have become dominated by short-term performance metrics and financial engineering, rewarding buybacks, roll-ups, and arbitrage over long-horizon investment in productive assets, workforce development, and infrastructure. Third, policy frameworks, trade, tax, regulatory, and monetary, have often been designed or captured in ways that privileged scale without responsibility. The largest actors can externalize risks and costs, while smaller local firms bear disproportionate burdens. The predictable result is a kind of slow-motion internal deindustrialization and social erosion. Regions that once anchored national production lose their core industries. The local tax base shrinks. Skilled workers either leave or see their skills devalued. Younger generations lose meaningful pathways into stable livelihoods. As anchor employers disappear or consolidate far away, secondary and tertiary businesses, service firms, trades, small manufacturers, logistics operators, also weaken or close. The physical infrastructure deteriorates because there is no longer a robust, productive economy paying to maintain it. Social infrastructure follows suit. Schools, vocational programs, local banks, civic associations, and cultural institutions lose both funding and purpose as the underlying economic engine sputters. This is what it means to say the extractive system crushes the foundations. The foundational layers of a healthy society, family wage work, small and medium-sized enterprise ecosystems, local financial institutions, land stewardship, civic trust, are slowly pulverized to feed a model that rewards value extraction from the top. The system devours its own seed corn. Communities are left with a service-heavy, debt-fueled consumption economy that depends on imported goods, distant platforms, and opaque capital flows they neither control nor fully understand. When shocks arrive, pandemics, financial crises, geopolitical disruptions, or climate-related events, the lack of local productive capacity, redundant systems, and social cohesion turns what might have been manageable stresses into systemic crises. A vertically integrated, bottom-up regenerative economic model proceeds from very different assumptions. Instead of treating localities as interchangeable markets, it treats them as the primary building blocks of national strength. The starting point is the actual productive potential of place: land, water, energy, skills, culture, infrastructure, and existing industries. The question becomes, how can these be developed in ways that generate enduring value, retain a meaningful share of that value locally, and connect to larger state, regional, and national systems in mutually reinforcing ways? In a regenerative model, vertical integration is not simply about ownership of multiple stages of production by a single firm. It is about designing coherent value chains that run from local resource and talent bases up, through processing, manufacturing, logistics, and distribution, with governance and capital structures that ensure benefits flow back down the chain. A local agricultural or forestry base, for example, is linked to processing facilities, advanced manufacturing, and downstream product lines within a regional ecosystem. State policy aligns with these value chains by supporting infrastructure, education, and financing instruments tailored to the sector. Regional coordination ensures that clusters do not merely compete in a race to the bottom, but specialize and collaborate based on comparative advantages. At the top, national policy, trade, industrial strategy, defense planning, and fiscal tools is structured to reinforce these multi-level ecosystems rather than treat them as expendable. The regenerative model also reorients finance. Instead of prioritizing speculative gains and asset inflation, capital is directed toward productive investments that increase net real capacity. Upgrading industrial plants, building resilient grids, modernizing ports and rail, expanding vocational training and apprenticeships, and developing new technologies tied to real-world value creation. Financial instruments are designed to align returns with long-term performance of assets and communities, not quarterly optics. Local and regional financial institutions, community banks, credit unions, cooperative investment vehicles, and specialized development funds are central rather than peripheral. They understand local conditions, can price risk more accurately, and can partner with national institutions in layered financing structures that spread risk while preserving local agency. Crucially, a regenerative system treats labor and human capital as sources of compounding value rather than interchangeable inputs. Education and workforce development are anchored to real regional economic strategies, not abstract credentials markets. Apprenticeships, technical institutes, and continuous learning programs are built in concert with industry, so that skills formation, innovation, and productivity reinforce each other. Workers have clearer vistas of progression, from entry-level roles to skilled trades, from trades to supervisory and managerial positions, from local entrepreneurship to participation in regional and national supply chains. This growth pathway creates social stability and a genuine stake in the success of the broader system. Environment and land use are also reframed. Instead of strip mining land and communities to maximize short-term output, regenerative models prioritize stewardship, agroforestry, regenerative agriculture, sustainable forestry, circular manufacturing, and closed-loop resource systems are not niche ideals, but practical strategies to maintain productive capacity over decades. Healthy soils, forests, watersheds, and ecosystems are recognized as infrastructure, just as critical as roads and ports. Policies and business models are structured so that local stewards, farmers, landowners, cooperatives, are compensated for maintaining these assets, not punished for resisting conversion to more immediately lucrative but destructive uses. When comparing the two systems, the contrast becomes stark. The extractive model externalizes risk downward and outward. Communities bear the brunt of disinvestment, environmental degradation, and social fragmentation, while gains are privatized into ever more centralized pools of capital. The regenerative model internalizes responsibility upward and inward. Each level of the system, local, state, regional, national, has both obligations and tools to support the health of the others. In an extractive paradigm, scale is achieved by stripping power from smaller actors. In a regenerative paradigm, scale is achieved by connecting empowered local systems into larger networks. From a national security perspective, the differences are existential. An extractive economy that depends on long, fragile, globally outsourced supply chains for essential goods, energy, food, medicine, strategic materials, key components, is strategically vulnerable. Adversaries can exploit choke points, allies can be coerced, domestic politics become more brittle as external shocks propagate into domestic scarcity and fear. A regenerative economy with vertically integrated local to national value chains has redundancy, modularity, and autonomy. It can withstand disruptions, adapt to new conditions, and project strength without overextension because its base is broad, distributed, and resilient. From a social and political standpoint, regenerative structures rebuild trust. When people see that their work, land, and enterprises are connected to a coherent national story, and that policy frameworks genuinely support their productive efforts, cynicism diminishes. Citizens are more likely to accept hard choices and trade-offs when they trust that the system is not rigged against them. Conversely, an extractive model fuels populist backlash, fragmentation, and a pervasive sense that the game is fixed, because for many people, it demonstrably is. The consequence is a polity increasingly polarized and emotionally volatile, easier to manipulate by domestic demagogues and foreign information operations alike. Critics of a regenerative, vertically integrated model often argue that it sacrifices efficiency and cost advantages of globalized supply chains. This objection assumes that apparent short-term cost savings are the only relevant metric. It ignores systemic risk, strategic vulnerability, social degradation, and environmental damage, all of which eventually show up as real costs, just not on quarterly income statements. When these hidden liabilities are accounted for, the supposed efficiency of the extractive model reveals itself as a form of slow national cannibalization. Regenerative systems may involve higher upfront costs and more deliberate coordination, but they generate compounding returns in the form of stability, innovation, health, and strategic autonomy. There is also an argument about complexity. Building a vertically integrated, bottom-up regenerative architecture is too hard. In reality, both systems are complex. The difference is where the complexity is managed and to what end. The current extractive order pushes complexity into opaque financial instruments, sprawling global supply webs, and intricate regulatory arbitrage. This complexity benefits those with the expertise and capital to exploit it, but it makes the system brittle and incomprehensible to most. A regenerative model, by contrast, accepts the complexity of real places, real ecosystems, and real industries, and uses governance, technology, and finance to make that complexity manageable, transparent, and productive. Complexity exists either way. It is better to embed it in tangible, accountable systems than in abstractions that can collapse overnight. The choice between these models is not a theoretical exercise. Many regions already live with the consequences of extractive structures: shuttered plants, degraded land, hollowed-out towns, rising mortality and addiction, fraying families, and a pervasive sense of betrayal. The same dynamics that sour the foundations also limit options for reform. Once capacity is offshored, skills atrophy and infrastructures decay, making it harder to reshore or rebuild. That is why shifting to a regenerative model is both urgent and time-sensitive. The longer the extractive system runs, the more it consumes the very preconditions any future regeneration will require. Reestablishing a vertically integrated, local-to-national regenerative economic model is therefore not nostalgic protectionism or romantic localism. It is a disciplined strategy to reconstruct the real foundations of national strength: productive land, skilled people, resilient infrastructure, trustworthy institutions, and value chains that create, circulate, and retain wealth within the body of the nation, rather than siphon it away. It recognizes that a republic cannot remain stable if its citizens are reduced to precarious consumers in someone else's algorithmic marketplace. It understands that sovereignty without internal productive capacity is an illusion, and that social peace without economic dignity is temporary at best. In the end, the case is straightforward. An extractive economic model is a short-term optimization algorithm that consumes the foundations of its own existence. A vertically integrated, bottom-up regenerative economic model is a long-term architecture that cultivates those foundations so they can bear more weight over time. One deepens fragility while masking it with superficial growth. The other builds resilience even as it pursues prosperity. For any nation serious about survival, stability, and genuine flourishing, the choice between them is less an ideological preference and more a question of whether it intends to have a future worth inheriting. The historical shift from a regenerative economic model to the extractive architecture that now dominates the modern West was neither accidental nor instantaneous. It unfolded over several decades through a combination of ideological drift, policy reorientation, financial engineering, and the gradual substitution of productive value with financial valuation. The earlier American model, roughly from the mid-19th century through the mid-20th century, was grounded in vertically integrated, locally rooted productive systems. These systems built wealth through manufacturing, agriculture, resource development, and infrastructure tied to regions, not abstractions. Capital circulated through community banks, regional manufacturers, agricultural cooperatives, and local enterprises. Innovation emerged inside production ecosystems, not outside of them. Value creation and value retention were tightly coupled. This was regenerative economics in practice, even if the term had not yet been coined. The disruption began with the post. World War II's shift toward global financial liberalization, which accelerated in the 1970s and emerged triumphant in the 1980s, 1990s, under the banners of neoliberalism, privatization, deregulation, and the ideology of free capital flows. Instead of capital serving productive industry was increasingly asked to serve capital. The merchant industrial class that once anchored the Republic's regional economies gave way to a financial managerial class whose incentives were detached from place, community, and national resilience. Manufacturing was offshored in pursuit of lower labor costs, supply chains stretched across oceans, and local banks were consolidated into national behemoths whose risk models favored speculation over productive lending. Land was financialized, labor was commodified, communities were reclassified as markets. National strategy devolved into quarterly earnings. The 1990s, embrace of hyper-globalization, epitomized by the WTO, NAFTA, and China's integration into global markets, severed what remained of the regenerative architecture. The U.S. traded strategic autonomy for cheap imports and asset inflation. The logic was deceptively simple. Let production flow to low-cost jurisdictions, let finance chase yield wherever it can find it, and let the American consumer be the engine of global demand. That arrangement produced a temporary illusion of abundance, but it extracted value from the nation's foundational layers. The middle class eroded, rural economies collapsed, industrial centers hollowed out, and state-level ecosystems atrophied. What had once been a broad, thick, productive economic base became a narrow, globally dispersed system of dependencies managed by financial intermediaries. By the early 21st century, the extractive model had fully replaced the regenerative one. Instead of building real capacities, manufacturing ecosystems, skilled labor pools, resilient supply chains, the nation built financial derivatives, asset bubbles, and speculative instruments detached from physical reality. Instead of integrating local to regional to national value chains, it integrated credit markets and digital platforms. Instead of cultivating long-term resilience, it optimized for short-term profitability and perpetual externalization of costs. The cultural and political narratives followed suit. Citizens were no longer producers or stewards of the commons. They were consumers. Nation-states were no longer coherent, productive civilizations. They were markets. Work was no longer a contribution to shared prosperity. It was a fungible input in a global spreadsheet. This architecture is not merely unsustainable. It is suicidal on both civilizational and economic grounds. Systems built on extraction inevitably cannibalize their own foundations. They hollow out industrial capacity until supply chains become critically brittle. They degrade land and resources until environmental shocks amplify economic ones. They erode the skilled labor base until technological leadership becomes fragile. They weaken civic institutions until trust collapses and political polarization spirals. They create a culture of financial dependency and speculative expectation that leaves entire populations vulnerable to cascading failures once shocks arrive. And the shocks are now arriving in waves. Economically, the system is entering the classic phase of terminal fragility. Asset bubbles are decoupled from real productivity. National security is compromised by reliance on foreign-controlled supply chains. Inflationary and deflationary pressures collide in unpredictable ways. Interest rate regimes can no longer stimulate productive investment because the industrial base that once responded to such signals has been offshored. Debt loads, public, private, corporate, are spiraling upward without corresponding real capacity to service them over time. Meanwhile, the extractive incentives that drove the system continue to accelerate. Consolidation, financial engineering, outsourcing, and speculative capital flows. This is not a system that self-corrects. It is a system that self-reinforces its own destruction. Civilizationally, the extractive model exhibits the cultural symptoms of a late-stage empire. Decadence at the top, disillusionment at the bottom, cynicism spreading between them. The public senses the underlying disorder even when they cannot articulate its mechanics. Institutions are distrusted because they no longer produce public value. National purpose is incoherent because the economic architecture no longer orients the society toward shared futures. Geopolitically, dependency replaces sovereignty. Domestically, despair replaces aspiration. A nation cannot sustain legitimacy when its economic system produces precarity for the many and artificial abundance for the few. Nor can it sustain long-term unity when local regions understand, even without academic language, that they have been systematically emptied to feed distant abstractions. The collapse signals are becoming unmistakable. Supply chains that once seemed invincible now fracture under mild stress. Industries once considered permanent are now vulnerable to foreign coercion, cyber disruption, or geopolitical realignment. Local communities cannot rebuild because the scaffolding of productive capacity has been stripped away. Inflationary volatility exposes the absence of domestic redundancy. Political division intensifies as communities search for culprits, unaware that the architecture itself, not merely its operators, is the culprit. No civilization has survived long-term when it allowed its productive engines, its land, its people, and its institutions to be converted into expendable assets for a small managerial elite. History is unambiguous on this point. This brings us to the unavoidable imperative. The regenerative model must be reestablished now, not later. Every year lost compounds the difficulty and cost of reconstruction. The extractive system cannot be repaired by old playbooks. Those playbooks built the problem. Modern industrial policy, trained on the abstractions of macroeconomic indicators and global capital flows, cannot solve a problem rooted in degraded local ecosystems and disconnected regional architectures. Traditional top-down strategies cannot regenerate bottom-up economic health because they do not understand the granular realities of local production. New financial instruments that mimic the aesthetic of investment without altering the underlying incentives will merely perpetuate the existing dysfunction. The tools and paradigms that broke the system cannot be expected to rebuild it. Thinking differently begins with acknowledging that regeneration is not a nostalgic return to the past, but a redesign of the entire economic stack from the ground up. It means returning productive capacity to communities while connecting those communities to state and regional clusters that build scale without erasing local agency. It means restructuring finance to reward long-term productive investment rather than short-term extraction. It means aligning national strategy with the real economy rather than the financial imaginary. It means recognizing that the stability of a 60,000-foot national strategy depends on the resilience of a 6-foot square of local soil. A 6-person workshop, a 6-mile logistics corridor, and a 6-year apprenticeship pipeline. Regeneration is relational. Extraction is isolating. One builds upward from strength. The other drains downward from weakness. The urgency cannot be overstated. The extractive system has already breached critical thresholds. It is eating into the load-bearing beams of national life. Industrial base, trust, productive land, civic cohesion, strategic autonomy. Unless reversed, the collapse will not be cyclical. It will be structural and long-lasting. Regeneration is no longer an academic preference. It is a civilizational necessity. Reestablishing a vertically integrated, locally rooted, regionally scaled, nationally aligned economic architecture is the only path to arrest the decay and rebuild a society capable of withstanding the turbulence ahead. The nation cannot afford to misdiagnose this moment as a temporary downturn or policy misalignment. It is a structural failure of the entire extractive paradigm. The solution requires a complete reorientation toward the regenerative model that once built the country and can build it again. The old playbooks have reached the point of diminishing returns. A new architecture, bottom-up, place-based, vertically integrated, strategically oriented, is the only viable path to reconstituting strength, restoring dignity to communities, and securing a future that is not merely survivable, but generative. In short, regeneration is not an option. It is the last responsible choice before the consequences become irreversible. If the extractive paradigm is not replaced, the consequences will unfold in a sequence, not a single dramatic moment. It will resemble neither the sudden collapse of an empire nor the neat failure of a corporation. It will instead manifest as cascading systemic breakdowns across economic, social, institutional, and geopolitical domains, each reinforcing the others until the system loses coherence. These are not speculative hypotheticals. They are the early-stage dynamics already visible across the West. The severity of what follows if the paradigm remains unchanged can be understood in 5 compounding layers of consequence. First, the economic architecture will continue to hollow out until it reaches a point where basic functional systems, energy, materials, manufacturing, logistics, and finance begin to fail simultaneously. When a nation no longer possesses the industrial base to produce its own critical goods, it becomes structurally dependent on foreign actors. As global volatility increases, these dependencies will turn to vulnerabilities that can be exploited or cut off. Supply shortages will no longer be inconveniences. They will be destabilizing shocks. Essential goods, pharmaceutical precursors, critical minerals, semiconductors, grid components, transportation equipment, agricultural inputs will become intermittently scarce, unpredictably priced, or politically weaponized. The extractive system cannot respond to these shortages because it dismantled the very capacity required to resolve them. The result is embedded fragility, a society vulnerable to disruption faster than it can repair itself. Second, the social fabric will degrade in proportion to the economic collapse beneath it. When work loses dignity, opportunity becomes scarce, and communities lose their economic anchors, social cohesion collapses. This leads to rising violence, addiction, mental health disorders, and political radicalization. The middle class, already shrinking, will bifurcate further into a precarious service sector on one side and a small, insulated professional elite on the other. As upward mobility disappears, frustration turns from quiet despair to active resentment. Trust in public institutions drops further, eventually reaching levels incompatible with stable Chilean governance. Once trust collapses below a certain threshold, even competent institutions cannot function, because legitimacy, not capacity, is what sustains governing systems. The extractive paradigm accelerates this collapse by converting citizens into clients of distant systems they cannot influence. Third, the cascade will reach the political superstructure, where dysfunction becomes entrenched and governance becomes erratic, crisis-driven, and reactive. A political system dependent on a stable economic base cannot survive when that base erodes. As economic precarity spreads, political grievances multiply and elections become zero-sum contests for diminishing resources. Policy becomes polarized not only ideologically but geographically, with regions experiencing radically different realities. Federal systems fracture under the strain. State and local governments increasingly diverge in capability and resources. In this environment, policymaking is captured by those with the capital and influence to insulate themselves from consequences, further intensifying the perception and the reality of corruption. Political extremism rises because the center cannot hold when the material foundations of the center have collapsed. In such conditions, even moderate shocks, economic, geopolitical, or environmental, can trigger institutional paralysis. Fourth, geopolitical vulnerability escalates rapidly as internal weakness invites external probing. Nations do not collapse in isolation. They collapse in the presence of adversaries. Once strategic competitors recognize that the West cannot produce essential goods, cannot unify its political class, and cannot guarantee social stability, they adjust their strategies accordingly. Economic coercion becomes more feasible. Supply chain manipulation becomes a tool of statecraft. Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure become more damaging because resiliency has declined. Proxy conflicts expand. Alliances weaken as partners lose confidence in Western resolve or capacity. The cumulative effect is a geopolitical environment where the West is reactive rather than strategic, vulnerable rather than deterrent. No amount of advanced technology or military spending can compensate for a broken industrial base and a fractured society. Power projection becomes unsustainable when domestic coherence dissolves. Fifth, even the elites who initially believe they can protect themselves will eventually face consequences they cannot evade. The top tier of American and Western society has long assumed that instability affects other people first. Offshoring, financialization, and global outsourcing were justified because they delivered short-term abundance to those at the top while masking the long-term erosion beneath. But the cascade effects of systemic collapse do not observe class boundaries. Even the most insulated strata rely on functional supply chains, secure infrastructure, stable governance, and social order. When the foundational layers fracture, the upper layers lose their footing regardless of wealth. The wealthy will still face shortages of essential goods. They will still be affected by failing infrastructure. They will still encounter spiraling political instability, capital flight, and currency volatility. They will still be vulnerable to geopolitical coercion because national strength is not an individual asset, Most importantly, they cannot buy themselves out of a collapsing civic fabric. Private security cannot replace public order. Offshore accounts cannot replace domestic stability. Panic rooms cannot substitute for a functioning society. When the extractive paradigm reaches terminal decline, the consequences metastasize across all domains at once. Wealth loses meaning when the systems that support it no longer function. Influence loses value when the institutions meant to implement it lose legitimacy. Power loses its grip when the social body beneath it disintegrates. A civilization cannot survive when its economic foundations dry up, its social cohesion fractures, its political system destabilizes, and its geopolitical posture weakens. And unlike cyclical downturns, structural collapses do not self-repair. They must be rebuilt from the bottom up, exactly as they were constructed in prior eras. This is why reestablishing a regenerative economic model is not merely preferable. It is imperative. The window for rebuilding is narrowing, not expanding. Every year the nation delays, the cost of reconstruction grows exponentially. The extractive system cannot stabilize itself because its core logic, externalize, arbitrage, offshore, consolidate, is fundamentally incompatible with renewal. The regenerative model, by contrast, is designed to rebuild capacity, distribute risk, retain value locally, and strengthen the civic fabric required for a functioning nation-state. The old playbooks will not save a system that they themselves created. They cannot reverse the damage because they were optimized for the very incentives that produced the decline. New thinking, rooted in local productivity, regional integration, national strategy, and long-term stewardship, is required now. If the paradigm does not shift soon, collapse will not be an avoidable future. It will be the default trajectory. The consequences of inaction will not spare anyone. The cascade effects will sweep across class lines, geographic boundaries, political identities, and institutional silos. The center will not hold. The edges will not stabilize. The top will not escape the consequences of the bottom's collapse. Civilization is a system, and when the foundations crumble, everything built upon them must fall. The choice is stark. Regenerate now or face a collapse that leaves no one outside its shadow. The inability to shift paradigms is not simply a failure of will. It is the predictable consequence of entrenched cognitive and institutional habits within the three groups most responsible for shaping the economic system: commercial interests and titans of the financial system, bureaucrats, and academics. Each occupies a different vantage point, yet all share a common flaw. They remain committed to frameworks that cannot comprehend, let alone correct, the systemic collapse already underway. Their assumptions, incentives, and intellectual architectures were built for a world that no longer exists. And because they mistake familiarity for truth, they continue to apply obsolete playbooks to novel problems, accelerating failure, while believing they are preserving stability. Commercial interests and the titans of the financial system, those who dominate capital markets, multinational corporate strategy, global consulting, and large-scale investment flows, are trapped in a paradigm of perpetual scaling, cost minimization, and arbitrage-based growth. Their mental models were shaped during an era when globalization appeared boundless, and financial engineering masqueraded as value creation. As a result, they continued to see efficiency where resilience is required, consolidation where diversification is necessary, and asset-light structures where real productive capability is essential. These actors reflexively evaluate decisions through the narrow lens of short-term financial signals, ignoring long-term national stability, ecological limits, or systemic vulnerability. Their tools, discounted cash flow models, total shareholder return metrics, global arbitrage analyses, were designed for a world in which supply chains were reliable, geopolitics was subdued, and capital could move frictionlessly. That world has fractured, yet the financial elite continues to operate as if quarterly models can navigate civilizational transitions and geopolitical realignments. The deeper problem is that many titans of finance assume the extractive architecture will protect them indefinitely. They presume that global supply chains can always be restructured. Capital will always find safe haven, and consumption will always be buoyant. These beliefs are not strategy. They are delusions. Commercial interests have become custodians of a dying paradigm, too invested in its mechanics to imagine the need for a new architecture. Bureaucrats face a different trap, rooted in structural inertia, insulation from consequence, and an institutional culture that equates procedural continuity with good governance. The bureaucratic mindset is conditioned to manage existing systems, not redesign them. Agencies built for administering stable programs cannot conceptualize, much less engineer, a structural transformation of the national economy. The instinct is always to refine processes, adjust incentives, add oversight layers, update compliance requirements. But these incremental adjustments cannot correct a system collapsing from foundational design failures. Bureaucratic time horizons, shaped by political cycles and risk-averse cultures, prevent the pursuit of long-term regenerative strategies. Transformations that require decades of consistent investment, cross-sector alignment, and radical restructuring are pushed aside as impractical, costly, or outside statutory authority. Bureaucracies, once capable of building the nation's industrial base, now preside helplessly over its deterioration. Unable to reverse a process they neither initiated nor fully understand. They cling to the illusion of control long after real control has migrated to global markets and geopolitical fault lines. Academics, particularly in economics, policy analysis, and social theory, are the most conceptually insulated and therefore often the most blind to the severity of the unfolding crisis. Many continue to teach and publish models built on assumptions that are no longer operative. Infinite resource, substitutability, self-correcting markets, rational actors, steady-state growth, and frictionless global supply chains. Their frameworks often treat national resilience, industrial capacity, and geopolitical constraints as peripheral concerns, anachronisms from a bygone era. This intellectual detachment has produced a generation of policymakers and economists trained to believe that physical production is secondary, geography is irrelevant, and financial markets are the primary locus of economic truth. Academic rewards reinforce this detachment. Publication incentives privilege theoretical abstraction over practical application. Disciplinary silos prevent integrated understanding across ecology, engineering, economics, and geopolitics. And institutional cultures discourage challenges to orthodoxy. The result is an intellectual class that often reinforces the very policies, offshoring, deregulation, financial liberalization, that built the extractive paradigm now failing. Because these ideas were once dressed in the language of scientific inevitability, reversing them now requires confronting decades of mistaken assumptions. All three groups, commercial interests and financial titans, bureaucrats, and academics, are locked into a shared illusion that better management of the current paradigm will save it. They cannot see that the architecture itself is the root of the collapse. They continue to adjust parameters of a failing model instead of replacing the model entirely. They attempt to repair a system whose very logic, global arbitrage, asset inflation, externalized costs, ensures it will ultimately consume its own foundations. Their mental maps do not permit them to imagine a locally grounded, vertically integrated regenerative architecture, because they were trained to view such systems as economically primitive. They assume the future must be a more optimized version of the present, rather than a different order altogether. They believe the extractive system is the inevitable pinnacle of modernity, not a transient artifact of an unusual global moment now ending. This cognitive rigidity is itself a form of systemic risk. Civilizations rarely fall simply because of external shocks. They fall because their elites cling to obsolete models long after those models have ceased to function. The West is now in precisely that position. The commercial and financial elite cannot imagine an economic architecture that is not globally extractive. Bureaucracies cannot conceive of a governance model not dominated by procedural continuity. Academics cannot permit themselves to admit that many of their core assumptions have failed. So the extractive system accelerates toward collapse, while its stewards interpret the tremors as minor turbulence. They misread structural unraveling as temporary volatility. They insist that institutions will hold because they have held in the past. They champion resilience while presiding over cascading fragility. They preach confidence while the foundations erode beneath them. A regenerative economic model requires a fundamentally different mindset, place-based, long-term, interdisciplinary, and committed to value creation rather than extraction. It requires treating economies as living systems, not financial abstractions. It requires acknowledging that national stability is rooted in physical capacity, energy, materials, food, manufacturing, not theoretical equilibria. It demands leaders who can think beyond the limits of global arbitrage and bureaucratic habits. Until the commercial titans, bureaucratic structures, and academic institutions acknowledge that the paradigm they defend is failing, they will remain accelerants of decline, not agents of renewal. And because they are the last to perceive collapse, they will be the last to understand why regeneration must begin outside their frameworks. The future will belong to those capable of breaking with the illusions of the past and designing a system that can sustain a society rather than extract from it. The old custodians cannot save what they do not grasp. The regenerative paradigm must emerge beyond the perimeter of their assumptions, or it will not emerge at all. A conclusion worthy of the present moment must begin with the clarity that the crisis is structural, not cyclical, civilizational, not merely economic, and existential, not rhetorical. The extractive paradigm that has governed the West for decades, celebrated by commercial interests, normalized by bureaucratic inertia, and justified by academic orthodoxy, has reached the end of its useful life. It cannot be reformed by marginal policy adjustments, rescued by financial ingenuity, or stabilized through incremental improvements. The architecture itself is incompatible with the national resilience, social cohesion, strategic autonomy, and long-term prosperity. It devours its base in order to sustain its apex, and in doing so, destabilizes the very foundations on which a functional society depends. The historical trajectory is unambiguous. The nation once thrived under a regenerative model rooted in local production, regional integration, national strategy, and long-horizon investment. This was not accidental. It reflected a deep alignment between productive capacity, civic life, and strategic purpose. Over time, that alignment was dismantled and replaced with a system optimized for short-term gains, global arbitrage, and financial abstraction. The consequences have been profound. fractured supply chains, hollowed communities, decaying infrastructure, eroded trust, and rising geopolitical vulnerability. The extractive model has not produced a dynamic society. It has produced a brittle one. The severity of what lies ahead, if the paradigm remains unchanged, cannot be overstated. The consequences will touch every sector, every class, every region. Economic fragility will evolve into sustained instability. Social disintegration will translate into political volatility. Institutional dysfunction will compound geopolitical risk. The belief that elites can insulate themselves is not merely misguided, it is historically illiterate. Collapse is not selective. Once the foundational layers give way, the system fails from the bottom and the top simultaneously. Yet the path forward is neither despair nor resignation, it is reconstruction. The regenerative model is not a nostalgic return to an idealized past, but a technologically advanced, strategically aligned, place-based architecture capable of restoring capacity, coherence, and resilience. It recognizes that national strength arises from the ground up, from communities that produce value, from regions that coordinate industry, infrastructure, and skills, from a nation that aligns policy, finance, and strategy with the real economy rather than financial mirages. Regeneration is not merely an economic framework, it is a civilizational reorientation. To pursue regeneration is to break with the illusions of the extractive system and embrace the reality that living systems, not spreadsheets, determine the survival of nations. It is to accept that resilience requires redundancy, stewardship, and long-term investment in people, land, and productive capacity. It is to understand that the West's prosperity was not built by speculation, but by sustained, coordinated work across generations. It is to recognize that the old playbooks cannot lead us into the future because they were designed for a world that has vanished. The urgency is real. The window for action is narrowing. The costs of delay compound by the year, but rebuilding is possible and necessary. The decision before the nation is not between comfort and hardship. It is between regeneration and collapse. No amount of rhetoric, financial engineering, or technocratic confidence can change that. What can change it is a deliberate choice to build an economy that creates, retains, and circulates value rather than extracts and exhausts it. In the final analysis, the contrast between the extractive and regenerative paradigms is the contrast between a society that consumes itself and a society that sustains itself. One leads to inevitable decline, the other to renewed strength. The future belongs to those with the courage to abandon failing frameworks, confront uncomfortable truths, and design anew. Regeneration is the only path that leads forward. Everything else is a managed descent into consequences no nation can endure. Conclusion. The sword through the illusion. If my author's note served as the polite clearing of the throat before the critique, this conclusion is the moment the scalpel meets bone. What has been laid out across this document is not a minor disagreement with Washington's preferred economic hymnal. It is a comprehensive indictment of a paradigm that has exhausted its usefulness, outlived its intellectual justifications, and now functions primarily as a means of preserving the comfort of those who designed it. The Council on Foreign Relations and its constellation of policy institutions have for decades positioned themselves as the keepers of American strategic wisdom. Yet their wisdom increasingly resembles an elaborate form of nostalgia disguised as expertise. It is the kind of thinking that confidently assures the nation everything is fine while the hull quietly takes on water. It is the worldview of people so committed to the architecture of the past that they cannot see the cracks spreading across the walls. In truth, what these institutions call strategy is often a sophisticated form of denial. Their frameworks assume that global supply chains will remain stable, that financial abstraction will continue to substitute for real production, and that nations can indefinitely outsource the foundations of sovereignty without consequence. They speak of competitive strength while presiding over competitive erosion. They extol the virtues of openness while ignoring the vulnerabilities it created. They celebrate integration while neglecting to mention that integration has enriched rivals and impoverished their own industrial base. The absurdity would be humorous if the stakes were not so high. The arrogance would be laughable if its consequences were not so predictable. And the intellectual complacency would be almost endearing if it weren't steering the nation toward strategic irrelevance. The truth, brutal, empirical, unavoidable, is that the extractive paradigm is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The model that Washington, Wall Street, and academia jointly defended as the pinnacle of modern economic thought has revealed itself to be little more than a clever method of strip-mining national strength and exporting it abroad. A society cannot sustain prosperity by hollowing out its productive base, eroding its middle class, degrading its land, and outsourcing its future. It cannot maintain sovereignty by relying on its competitors for critical materials, essential medicines, energy inputs, and manufacturing capacity. And it cannot preserve global leadership by pretending that the world will indefinitely conform to assumptions that died a decade ago. This is the point where satire becomes indistinguishable from realism. The farce has blended seamlessly with the facts. The crisis the nation faces is not the result of insufficient complexity in the old frameworks. It is the result of the frameworks themselves. The old playbooks are not misapplied. They are obsolete. They are relics of an era when the world was more forgiving, America was less dependent, and the consequences of faulty thinking took longer to arrive. That era has passed, yet its defenders remain curiously unaware, like cartographers still drawing maps of an empire that no longer exists. The path forward is clear, though few in positions of influence seem willing to acknowledge it. Regeneration, not refinement. Rebuilding, not rebranding. A return to the hard disciplines of production, stewardship, local grounding, regional coordination, and national strategy. Not the soft comforts of financial hallucination and globalist dogma. A regenerative economy is not a sentimental yearning for an imagined past. It is a sober recognition that civilizations survive only when they renew their foundations. It is a model that aligns reality with responsibility, capacity with sovereignty, and prosperity with actual production. It treats communities not as expendable cost centers, but as the primary engines of national vitality. It places resilience above efficiency, long-term value above short-term extraction, and national endurance above quarterly returns. In the end, the choice before the nation is not philosophical. It is existential. Either it abandons the extractive paradigm and rebuilds a regenerative one, or it continues down a path that will render satire unnecessary because reality will have become far more absurd than any critique could capture. Institutions may cling to the illusion that the status quo can be saved. Panels may continue to reassure themselves that minor adjustments will suffice. Experts may polish their arguments and refine their vocabulary. But the foundational truth remains. A system that destroys its base will not survive its apex. A nation that abandons regeneration invites collapse. And the leadership class, clinging to failed frameworks, is a liability, not an asset. What comes next will not be determined by those who defend the old playbooks, but by those willing to write entirely new ones. This conclusion is not merely an endnote. It is the dividing line between a civilization that chooses renewal and one that chooses consequence. The sword is now fully through the illusion. The question that remains is whether the nation will finally see what was always there. As always, as it is for people, so too for the nation. A concept apparently not yet conceived nor comprehended rightly by the so-called bureaucratic and academic, corporate, and think tank geniuses. So let me state it again for them to contemplate in a quiet moment of solitude. As for people, so too for the nation.